and I'm a senior, and I just wanted to share a little bit about what you guys just saw. So the whole week when we were in Mexico, we were serving and building cisterns in a town called Castillo Rito. As Sunday rolled around, one of our last days there, we all decided that we wanted to go to the church service in Castillo, since that had been the community we were serving with and alongside the whole week. I honestly thought I wasn't going to get a lot out of it, considering it was in Spanish, and I don't really speak Spanish, or at least I'm not very good at it when I try. So I kind of just went in being like, oh, I'll just go, but I'm not really going to get a lot out of it, but I really couldn't have been more wrong. Something that the pastor was talking a lot about, and that really just stuck with me, was the fact that God shows us who he is through his creation. And when I think about that, usually I think about creation as beautiful mountains or sunsets or bodies of water. But this trip really showed me that the people around me are like God's creation, and that's where I'm able to see more of who God is. And as a result of that, I got to experience God in a really cool way when I was in Xpujil. I think the most obvious places I saw him was in the kids we played with at VBS, the people in Castillo Rito we were able to work alongside, and the people from this church that I had the opportunity to get to know a little better. As we pulled up to the church for VBS after our first day of work, there were a group of kids that started to run towards our van. I remember looking out of the windows and seeing like all these smiling faces, and they just looked so excited to see us. And as we all stepped out, we kind of got in like a half circle as they're all just like wide eyes, just so excited to see all of us. And we kind of started walking toward the church, and one of the girls came and grabbed my hand and walked me from outside all the way in to a place to sit inside of the church. I think the way those kids welcomed us, people that looked and spoke completely differently than they did and people they didn't even know, was a beautiful picture of the way Christ would have welcomed us if he had been standing right there. I felt a part of their community because they just had this excitement when they saw us, despite knowing anything really about us. And I just felt like they welcomed and accepted us like Jesus would have. And that's just a place where I really saw him and that I've been thinking about a lot. Another way I was able to see God this past week was in the group of men we were able to work with from Castillo Rito. No matter how hot it was or how long they had already been working, because they would get up much earlier than we did, or how many times one of us dropped or accidentally spilled something, they never complained or lost their patience with us. And I was just so amazed by the joy I saw in them and how little they let the circumstances around them affect their work or their attitudes. And on one of the drives home, we were talking to Todd about this, and he said that they have this joy because they feel like the work that they're doing there is work that God created them to do. And after working with them for this past week, I was able to experience the joy that comes from doing purposeful work that you feel created to be doing. And I just thought that was really cool. As the week came to a close, I kept reflecting back on my favorite parts of the trip. And a lot of it was in the van rides and just hanging out with the 10 of us that went from this church. And I just realized all the places I had been able to see Christ in the people that were right there with me from this church and from my home. So I have a couple examples of that. I saw Christ in Micah's energy at the VBS, in Kelsey's encouragement at the work site, in Elisa's knowledge of Spanish and never hesitation to go up and just use it, in Julia's humility, in Alex's readiness to work, in Teddy's patience, in Delaney's excitement, in Lawton's willingness to help, in Salta's desire to build relationships, and in Todd's leadership. This week has shown me the value of Christ-centered relationships and the value of the community that we have here in Palos Park. I'm so incredibly thankful for this past week and the ways I've seen God through the people around me. I would like to close with a verse that I think sums up what I've learned and what I've been able to see in action this past week. It's Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Alex Kruzik, and this was my third trip to Xpujil. And I can't emphasize enough how thankful I am that this church has supported a relationship with a church that is over 1,600 miles away. Going to Xpujil is a trip I've become pretty comfortable with. I went 3 times now. My first time I was 10, my second time I was 16, And this year I just look forward to a week of kind of unplugging and getting out of my regular routines and the monotony of my daily life and work. It's a little ironic, though, that I find my regular workday as kind of grueling because I caddy and I just do the same thing over and over again. Each day I find the ball and I clean the ball and blah, blah, blah. And it's awful. But I really like the work I do in Xpujil, even though I'm just picking up and carrying buckets all day, every day, 100 times a day. But I found that really enjoyable. And when Todd Luke, the missionary there, said, "Hey guys, try to work a little harder today because Victor, the foreman, is sick. Try to pick up slack so he doesn't have to work as hard." I really took that to heart. I was like, boom, let's do it. I'm going to put more effort into carrying buckets. And I didn't mind it. I started to think, that's how mission work is. You go out, you work hard, you're working for God, it's awesome, and then you go home and then real life is just kind of like, you just do that for a while. But when we got home at our team debrief, I started to realize after we discussed like transitioning back into regular life that I was frustrated and I didn't feel as fulfilled as I did in Mexico. And that's when I realized that coming home after a mission trip would be a lot easier if I lived my regular life like I was on the mission field. When I had that realization on Friday night, I couldn't help but recall my conversation with Todd Luke, where he talked about the crew in Xpujil, talking about how building cisterns is their calling, like Angela mentioned. And they view themselves as representatives of Christ in all things they do. They won't swear on the job site because they act as if Christ is present with them in like the physical reality of their world. And they use that example that Jesus set for them to set for others and share his love by the example that they set. So in all honesty, this trip left me with a lot more questions than answers about how to take practical steps that make sure I live into the fact that I am constantly living in the presence of God and how I actually act like it, how I treat my daily life like I'm living in a mission field, or how I keep myself accountable to represent Christ in my daily encounters. So I hope you take the chance to kind of ponder those questions for yourself, because it gets at the heart of our vision here at PCC of how we live like Christ and love like Christ so others can know Christ. But in any case, I thank you all for supporting our trip to Xpujil and the church there, because it seems like they have a lot to teach us about how to live and love like Christ. So, thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Elisa, and I was a senior on the mission trip. In our pre-mission trip meetings and preparation, we prepared a lot for immersing ourselves in a different culture with a language barrier. Going into the trip, I was expecting a divide between us and the people of Castillo Brito that would be too large to cross. I realize now, after the trip, that I could not have been more wrong. Throughout the week, God taught me that he is present to us in all places, regardless of cultural and linguistic barriers. The first place where I witnessed God's presence on the trip was at the vacation Bible school that we helped with in Castillo Brito. We were going to serve at this VBS for 2 days. On the first day, when we drove up to the church, the kids started running out of the churchyard and gathered in front of the doors to our van. When we opened the doors and started to get out of the van, the kids grabbed our hands and led us into their church. This amazed me. These kids, who were probably anywhere from 3 to 13 years old, welcomed us with open arms without even knowing who we are. They didn't know our names or even if they'd be able to communicate with us. They just welcomed us in without question, and this showed me God's love. The second place where I saw God present was during the church service that we attended last Sunday. We went to the service at the same church in Castillo Brito where we helped with the vacation Bible school. Their service differed from the services we have here at our church in so many ways. First, it was all in Spanish, and I was only able to understand about 5% of what the people were saying. The order of the service was very different and much longer, about 1 hour and 45 minutes. They sang more traditional hymns, not the Christian praise songs that we normally sing at our contemporary service. They also had many more psalms and scripture passages, and there were times in the service where members of the congregation just stood up and prayed to God and said what was on their minds in front of their families, friends, and neighbors. Despite all of these differences, I loved every second of the service. I was able to feel God's presence, even though I couldn't understand what they were saying, and we honestly didn't even know what was going on for a lot of the service. I was just able to feel feel that God was there and that even though they were worshiping in a completely different way, he was still present regardless of the customs and traditions. Through these experiences, I realized that the separations that we experience through culture and language do not stop God from revealing himself to us. God's community extends far beyond our church community here in Payless. It truly is universal. I would like to take a moment to thank God for all that he has done in our community and his church in Xpujil. So if you could please bow your heads and pray with me. Dear God, thank you for sending us to Xpujil last week and for revealing yourself to us in another culture. It is incredible that you are able to overcome obstacles that seem so daunting to us to create a universal church. Thank you for showing us your love and presence through the children at the Vacation Bible School and the church service that we attended in Castillo Brito. Thank you so much for blessing us with such an incredible community here in Payless to come back to and share our thoughts on the mission trip with. And please help us to continue to seek you out in our church here in Payless and to treat others with the same love that you treat us with. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just start by saying how awesome and impressed I am by our seniors? Man, I got to spend a whole week with these guys. You guys are fantastic. Well, thank you, Angela and Alex and Elisa, for sharing your experiences about our trip. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to everybody who prayed for this trip, who encouraged this trip, who supported this trip or donated to this trip in any way. We, like Alex said, can't do this without the support of you guys, and we're so grateful for the chance to maintain this relationship with Todd. And I love how trips like this between churches really involve so many different people from so many different ages and backgrounds and gifts all coming together to add to what God has in store for all of us. So we left for Mexico 2 Tuesdays ago with one goal: to learn from our mission partners how to get better at impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus. And I had all kinds of expectations about what that learning was going to look like. I'd been there before I'd done this. I had some expectations. I imagined our students working their butts off and intentionally getting to know the people around us. And let me tell you, as you saw, they definitely didn't disappoint in that part. And I imagined leading these incredible debriefing sessions every night, filled with awesome insights and tons of practical takeaways. But, it turns out that when everybody's exhausted from working their butts off all day, it really isn't the best time to ask a bunch of questions that require deep thinking. But luckily for me, God had planned ahead, and he invited on this trip 9 awesome students and leaders. And they went ahead and had some of those great conversations about life and faith on their own throughout the trip, usually while I was passed out in a van somewhere. And I also imagined coming home with, one set target, some specific command from God that our youth group had identified, one need in our community that our youth group was going to tackle right away. And I imagined that all of us would be super energized to get out there and tackle it right away, right? But it turns out that most of us, when we got back, were just really tired instead. So I had a couple of unrealistic expectations going into this trip. But what I didn't expect was the one lesson that God actually wanted to teach me. I didn't expect to learn that impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus is a lot simpler than I tend to make it. Now notice I didn't say that it's easier than I tend to make it. It's definitely not easier than sitting in my office brainstorming big plans. But it is a lot simpler. What I learned from this trip all the way to Xpujil, Mexico, is that impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus is really all about remaining connected with Jesus throughout your day and obeying his command to love people. In other words, it's all about loving God and loving people. Revolutionary, right? But you see, I tend to overcomplicate things, especially when it involves sharing Jesus with the people around me or doing missions. I assume that you need a book or a program created by the experts to properly make somebody grow spiritually, instead of just trusting that the Holy Spirit and the experience is going to take care of that. It turns out that we barely even used the books I made everybody buy for this week. But everybody did an awesome job of sharing their experience with God and with each other through their own personal journals and just in our random conversations in the vans. And I tend to assume that you need to be able to communicate very clearly and make sure that you're never misunderstood when you're representing Jesus. so that you don't offend anybody. But it turns out that speaking the same language isn't even really that big of a deal. And in reality, the grace and the unity of God's kingdom is pretty clearly seen when a talented crew of local Mexican Christians works so patiently with a bunch of amateur Americans who aren't even that great at shoveling buckets. I'm pretty sure God's kingdom was communicated way more clearly by the way that the local guys like Victor and Raul treated us and the way that they treated their neighbors that they were working with than by anything that any of us could have said. And you know what builds relationships with non-Christian people better than any program I've seen? Sweating a ton next to them while working together on something that's going to make their lives better. It turns out that impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus isn't so complicated after all. It doesn't even demand that we travel to another country. It really just involves staying closely connected to Jesus and following his prompts when it comes to loving people. Of course, that's not exactly a new revelation. That's exactly what Jesus says in John 15. In verse 5, Jesus says, "I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides or remains in me and I in him, he's the one that's going to bear much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." In verses 9 through 13, he says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you'll abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. And this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than that someone lay down his life for his friends." And that's the secret. That's the trick. That's my one takeaway from a week-long mission trip to another country. Me impacting the world around me with the love and message of Jesus depends on me abiding with Jesus, remaining closely connected to him every day so that I can love people like he would, even if it costs me what I think my life should look like. And you know what? The end result of that will be a life filled with the kind of a joy that attracts people to it and makes them ask how you got it. How do I know that? Because that was Todd's story that he told us all week long. See, we got to learn a lot about our mission partner, Todd Luke, this week, from his music choices to some of his ex-girlfriend stories. But the stories that have stuck with me are the ones that he tells about why he fell in love with his wife, Maria, and what he's learned about faith in Xpujil. When we asked Todd how he met his wife, Maria, and how they ended up getting married, we thought it was, just kind of a good get-to-know-you question. But then Todd started telling the story. Todd and Maria dated, I think, for like 6 months without even being able to communicate clearly. He spoke English and she spoke Spanish. They were both trying to learn, but he said that their first dates were a little rough. But what kept Todd so attracted to Maria was her relationship with Jesus. As he put it, she always acted like Jesus was right there next to her, because of course he is. She assumed and she behaved like Jesus was literally in the room with her. And when Todd saw her living like that, he wanted that too. And I think he said he waited like 6 years to marry her, partly because he wanted to make sure that he was on her level spiritually. It was the way that Maria spent her day abiding with Jesus that was so attractive to Todd. That's something really important for our high schoolers to hear, and our 30-year-old married somethings to hear. And it wasn't just Maria. On our last van ride back to the airport, Todd shared with us one of the most important things he's learned about living as a Christian while in Xpujil. Todd said that if we would take away anything from this trip and from watching guys like Victor and Raul, his hope was that it would be the value of depending daily on the presence of God. We talked a lot about how guys like Victor always seemed so happy. But Todd reminded us that they aren't necessarily happy. The rain was delayed this year, and these guys' farms were literally on the line. They had a lot to worry about. But they were able to work with the joy that we saw because they saw their lives and even their every day as something that Jesus was with them in. Every decision they made and every attitude they had was something they filtered through Jesus. Todd talked about how the church that we worshiped at would sometimes go without a pastor for a while. And when that happens, church goes back to being a group of normal, average people doing their best to follow Jesus. And these normal people go to the Bible and they find love God and love your neighbor. And so that's what they try to do. They love God by paying attention to him in whatever they do during the day. And they love their neighbors by following Jesus' prompts, like to visit somebody even when they don't feel like it, or to work on cisterns with neighbors who might not ever pay them back, or to host a bunch of annoying Americans every other week and then give all the glory to God. So impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus is really pretty simple. It involves paying attention to Jesus during our day and then obeying what he asks us to do. It involves reminding ourselves of the gospel and how loved we are by him and over again during our day, and becoming people who act based on that reality. And the good news is that God is the one whose job it is to make sure his kingdom is growing. God is the one who causes people and churches to grow or not grow. That's not up to us. Our job is just to stay connected to him and to follow his lead. So why is this such a foreign concept for us? On Friday night, our group got to debrief some more, and one of the questions we talked about was, when have you felt far from God since you've been back home? By the end of our discussion, we noticed that something most of our answers had in common was how busy and rushed we are. And that's one of the reasons why retreats and trips like this can be so important. They give us a chance to focus on our relationship with God and the time we get to spend with him. But I think one of the coolest parts about this idea of abiding with Jesus, or practicing the presence of God, as Todd Luke talked about, is that it doesn't require extra time or a 12-step process. It only requires a different way of seeing our relationship with Jesus and some intentionality. So after this week, I'm challenging myself, and I'd like to challenge you to prioritize abiding with Jesus by paying attention to him throughout your day as often as you can. Remember that Jesus is always with you and that he cares about everything you're going through in your day, no matter how mundane. He wants to be involved. And when your mind wanders, don't beat yourself up. Just invite Jesus back into whatever you're doing and into your mental conversation about it. Think about God as often as you can. And when he tells you to do something for someone, do it. It'll be worth it. You'll experience joy. One quick personal story to remind myself that this is true, and then I'll wrap this up. Back before Easter, our church was doing a series called, a series for Lent on 40 Acts. You guys remember that series? It was all about living generously in order to prepare ourselves for Easter. And so every day as a part of that, I would get a challenge sent to me with 3 ways that I could respond. And one day, the challenge was to pray out loud for a coworker or a friend or an acquaintance. And as soon as I read that, I groaned, literally out loud. That is so awkward for me, even working in a church, and I just dreaded the idea of it. I really didn't want to do it, and I assumed that I could probably get away with just skipping this one. But then I ran into Megan, who's our awesome custodian around here. And she was relatively new at the time, and so we just started talking. And she told me about her son and how he had strep throat again, which he gets all the time, and how going to the doctor with him can be so hard because he hates having his throat swabbed like anybody would, and how he had a doctor's appointment that day and she was just dreading it. And while I'm listening to this, I couldn't get that stupid challenge out of my head, as hard as I kept trying to ignore it. I kept feeling this nudge on my conscience. So finally, at the end of our conversation, I worked up the nerve to blurt out, Megan, do you care if I pray for your son? Which, of course, she was totally fine doing. And so we folded hands and prayed in the hall for like 30 seconds, and I felt super awkward. And that's the end of the story. No, not really. The next day, as soon as I walked into the building, I ran into Megan, and she had the biggest smile on her face. She said, Micah, your prayers must have worked, because my son was like a different person at the doctor yesterday. He wasn't scared of anything, and everything went super smoothly. And let me tell you, what I felt after that was awesome. That was joy. Not that I had done anything, because my 30-second prayer was pretty awful, but that I got to be part of God doing something that pointed all of us back to him. Let me tell you, I didn't stop smiling for like 3 days straight, and I'm pretty sure I told everybody that story. So the lesson that I've learned from Todd Luke in this trip to Xpujil is that impacting our world with the love and message of Jesus starts with us going back to the basics and staying closely connected to Jesus, and then listening when he tells us to do something. Will you pray with me?